Everyone. My name is Kate Van Lira, and I'm chair of the Historical Studies Department, which is organizing and hosting this event today. And I will be brief. I just want to welcome you here. And before I introduce Kevin Dulk, who's going to be today's moderator, I want to remind you briefly that this is part of our spring colloquium series and that there are two more events coming up in that series. The first is in just 2 weeks, or 2 weeks in a day. On March 31st, Professor Doug Howard, another colleague from our department, will be talking about the Ottoman Empire after Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And that's at 4 o'clock, not the usual 3:30 time, but that's also on Zoom. And then on April 28th, our annual student presentation of honors theses and independent research will be in person in the Meter Center. So that will be our last colloquium of the year, but our first in-person colloquium. So we hope you'll join us for one or both of those events. And those details are also on our department web calendar if you want to look them up again. Today's host and moderator, Kevin Dulk, is Associate Provost for the Global Campus. But before that, he directed the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics. And he's also a professor of political science with a longstanding interest in the politics of the West, which is what makes him so well suited to lead this event today, with a particular interest in water resources. And had it not been for COVID, he would have led an off-campus course this last summer with Jamie Skillen on water in the West in California. And I assume that they have hopes to reschedule that at some time in the future. But I will let Kevin introduce our two panelists. And thank you again all for coming.
Thanks, Kate. I will see if we get to teach that course again, but I am adamant that we'll be doing some of the highlights at the very least that we have planned for that course at some time in the future. So it's good to be here. It's good to be in some ways taken away from some of the other conversations I'm in lately, but also to have this conversation about, as the title says, vigilante justice from Old West to Washington, D.C. I have been in lots of discussions with Jamie and Will and others on campus about the politics of the West for quite some time. So this feels a little bit like coming back home to those conversations. So just briefly, I'm going to make a couple of introductions and then we'll jump in. Before I forget though, let me say something about format. So both Will and Jamie will take each about 10 to 15 minutes to talk a little bit about their specific topics. And then we're going to open it up to your questions. If you could hold off submitting questions until the end, and that includes submitting questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, but just to keep the distractions low, I'm noticing that my Teams is going off while we're in this. And you've all experienced the distractions, I'm sure yourselves, of that going off as presentations are ongoing. So please submit those at the end, and I will do my best to moderate them, and I might have some questions of my own along the way. Introductions, I'll start with Will Caterberg, a professor of history at Calvin, the curator of Heritage Hall, also the director of the Mellema program of Western American Studies, and he comes by that honestly. He's done a lot of research on the North American West. I was taking a look at Professor Caterberg's books just before I came in and realized how eclectic that is. I don't think I'd ever really put that together, Will, but some books on immigration, frontier sci-fi, Anglicans, conquest, you can find it all there. And so we'll be very interested to hear how he puts into historical perspective some of our experiences today. And then Jamie Skillen, Associate Professor of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies. I don't know if the new name is in place yet, so I'm just using the old one. And the Director of the Ecosystem Preserve here at Calvin. The author, most recently, of This Is My Land, and notice the play in that title, about enduring public lands conflicts in the American West, North American West, and also the author of the nation's largest landlord, about the Bureau of Land Management, both important books. I'd also just point out This Is My Land has some really fine illustrations in it.
So true, so true.
Check out. And so take a look. And some of you, especially students who may be here with us, know that Professor Skillen actively takes students out west to, sort of do field research and to learn about a variety of things ranging from, sort of the natural sciences, the biology, the geology of the West, but also the politics and social relations in the West. So we are very happy to have both of you here. Will, I think you're taking it off, starting us off here, and then Jamie will follow and then we'll have a conversation.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And thank you everybody for joining us. With regard to my eclecticism, I once had my supervisor, who's a historian of the American West, say to me in his very folksy way, "Will, you're more of a prospector than a miner." And he was describing what Kevin described, which is my eclectic approach to publications and research topics. I want to start with a quote by Richard White from October 1996, and I may be stealing something Jamie was going to quote as well, but there you have it. When he gave his presidential address at the Western Historical Association in Nebraska in October of that year, he called it the current weirdness in the West. What are we to make of the current outbreak of weirdness in the West, he asked. In the last year, we have had the Unabomber and the Freemen. We have had militias in Arizona, Montana, and Washington. There have been bombings in Oklahoma City and Nevada. We have the country independence movement, the Aryan nations, and the more extreme fringes of wise use. White wondered, why here in the West, why now? What in the region's history explained this weirdness? He answered his question by noting Western mythology, the massive presence of the federal government in the West, and federal control and regulation of public lands. And I expect Jamie will say more about that last issue especially. In 2021, we're asking similar questions, but about weirdness across the country. Proud Boys, QAnon, white nationalism, Christian nationalism, the whole President Trump phenomena. We can look back over the last 30 years and see increasing partisanship between the Republican and Democratic parties and their supporters, but the weirdness of the past 2 or 3 years seems different, the violent elements especially. What happened on January 6, 2021 is a symbolic moment and more. It feels like a line has been crossed. Videos of rioters storming the Capitol building to prevent Congress from certifying President-elect Joseph Biden as the 46th president stunned people across the United States and around the world. But vigilante violence in the name of law and order or justice has a long history in the United States. So too do conspiracy fears. Jamie is planning to focus on more recent history. I want to set out the deep context, the older history for January 6th. The extreme partisanship, perhaps, but especially fears of conspiracy. For example, the current fears that the election was stolen. And then second, vigilante tactics that we can say on January 6th passively supported or even were cheered on by some leaders in the Republican Party, both nationally and at the state level. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the deeper history of the American nation, and then I'll get to the older history of the American West and turn things over to Jamie. So the deeper history. Part of the reason I'm doing this is that, in my view, regional and national patterns always play into each other. They're in relationship with each other. This is a debate among Western historians. I tend to lean towards the strong influence of the nation on the American West. But I like a quote from Elliot West, a historian of the region. He said, "The American West is the United States, only more so." So the United States amped up. That's the American West, according to Elliot West. So a couple things then about the deeper history. When we're talking here about the colonial era and the revolutionary era, before the current American West was American. So never forget that the United States was founded in a revolution, a rebellion against taxes. That's kind of built into the nation's DNA, but not just a revolution against taxes, but against government control of frontier lands and a war against Native Americans. Great Britain was trying to keep peace with its native allies, keeping out white settlers. It was not just a war to win freedom from Britain, but a war to take control of the back country from Britain, and a vicious war against Native Americans so white settlers could take their land. In terms of the ideas or cultural habits, the worldview or thinking habits, we also should look to the deep history of the United States. And four things stand out, it seems to me, that go all the way back to our roots as a nation. Suspicion of central government, I just talked about that. Fears of conspiracy and corruption in society and government, that's playing out currently. And an apocalyptic tendency, a tendency to frame even small conflicts in the context of larger national, global, and even cosmic issues. Taxes don't just make you unhappy, they're a sign that the government is trying to take your freedom, and who knows, maybe even Satan or the great powers of the spiritual world have a stake in this. And then finally, fourth, a vision of white manhood, strong ideas about race and gender, in particular, an emphasis on male freedom, on male honor, the sense that all white men are equal in having this, and their status, their honor, depended on the relatively unequal status of non-whites and women. Another value, one often associated with the frontier that I think is deeply rooted in American history, is the idea of no duty to retreat. That is to say, when a man is threatened, his life or his property, his family, even simply his honor or his sense of identity, he has no obligation to retreat, to try and find a nonviolent way to get out of the situation. In fact, as this ideal evolved over the 19th century, especially with the influence of the Civil War, a generation of men who were raised in that horrible violence of that war, many of them having a hard time in the peace settlement in the years afterwards, and some of them from the North and the South heading into the West to try and find their fortune. That idea of no duty to retreat became almost an obligation if you were a real man, this sense of you don't retreat, you defend yourself, and you defend yourself violently. Well, we can see all of these values I've just described that are deeply in 1861 after the election of Abraham Lincoln. And as they seceded, Southerners, of course, were seceding over the issue of slavery. But another element to the story is their expressed fear, and I think they meant it, was that they feared being enslaved by the North, by the government of Abraham Lincoln, by people opposed to slavery, that their freedom, their honor as white men was being threatened. And that threat could also be described as they would be reduced to the status as white men, reduced to the status of non-white men or the status of a woman. So these ideas play out repeatedly in American history. It's interesting that there was talk of secession in the South during the 1950s in response to the desegregation movement, and especially in response to federal support of desegregation, including mustering troops. And then there's been talk about it more recently, especially when it looked like Joseph Biden might win the election, and then after he did win the election, talk about some states seceding from the United States. And I've seen occasional pundits talk a little bit about how the violence that we're seeing today reminds them of the violence in the decade before the American Civil War. All right. So that's some of the deeper history of the United States. Let me say a few things then about the older history of the American West. I'm not going to start with the mythology. I'll get to that second. One thing to emphasize in the history of the American West is the massive role of the federal government. That began with the conquest of the American West. The West was not conquered by cowboys. It was not conquered by lone individuals or even small communities. It was largely conquered by the American military, and only after the American military had pacified most areas of the West did large numbers of settlers go. There are exceptions to that, but it's a good generalization. In the wake of the conquest of the American West, especially after 1900, and especially after 1930, there was a massive federal presence in the West promoting economic development, building dams, building heavy industry, spending massive amounts of money on military bases, both Army and Navy. And this transformed the West from a more marginal economic region and a relatively more resource economy-oriented region into an industrial powerhouse. The irony is that despite arguably benefiting more than any other region of the country from federal spending, from federal efforts, there's been a deep level of resentment about the role of the federal government in the American West. In particular in rural areas where farmers and ranchers decried government interference in land use, even as they often received various kinds of subsidies in terms of prices for leasing public lands, when drought happened, things like that. But you find it more broadly beyond the rural West and even in the urban and suburban West. A frustration and an anger, a resentment against the role of the federal government, despite the heavy government investment in the region. So that's one factor to keep in mind. A second one would be the mythology of the American West. It's a mythology that emphasizes cowboys and Indians, cowboys often portrayed as knights. If you look at the long history of that idea of cowboys and them as a symbolic figure, they're often compared or depicted in novels and films as akin to the medieval knights of England and Germany. So there's a racial element to this as well, that they carry on the legacy of Northwestern Europeans and British or English knights, that there's this kind of honor to the cowboy. An emphasis on gun rights would be a second element of the mythology. An emphasis on redemptive violence, that violence is a way of making yourself, or when you failed in something, in redeeming yourself. I think the key thing I want to emphasize about the mythology is the way it plays up the mythic hero, the individual, and how that mythology covers over the real history where the central role has been played by the federal government. A third element to that history that I want to focus on, we might call the War of Incorporation. What American West historians mean by that is use of government and vigilante violence to control or to suppress a variety of kinds of groups, religious minorities like Mormons and Native Americans, racial minorities like Mexican Americans, Asians, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Part of that war, of course, is the conquest of Native peoples, segregating them onto reservation territories, and then forcibly assimilating them, often through schooling. Another part of that war of incorporation was violent suppression of labor unions. It also involved control of land and resources by wealthy individuals, families, and big businesses. And I want to emphasize that this war was waged partly by government and partly by vigilantes. I can give you more examples maybe in the conversation later, but one mythic example, if you've ever seen it, a movie like Shane. In the story, Shane is defending a small farmer against a big-time rancher, and the big-time rancher has hired gunfighters, and so Shane, the heroic character, shows up on this little rancher's farm and eventually helps the rancher and his families defend themselves against the big-time rancher. That mythic novel and film, Shane, is actually about a major conflict in Wyoming between small farmers and big-time ranchers. It's a mythologized example of this war of incorporation. And what it does is it turns a war to assert a kind of big business control over ranching in Wyoming into this kind of mythic narrative about gunfighters, cowboys, and so on. Race relations in the American West, I think, is the final thing I'll mention, and then I'll turn things over to Jamie for the more recent history. When we think of race relations in the United States as Americans, most of the time, I think Americans think of the South and the story of the enslavement of African peoples and their African American descendants, abolitionism, the Civil War, reconstruction of the South after the Civil War, and so on. but it's fair to say that the American West has been as significant in its impact in terms of national race relations, and in some ways provides an alternative way of envisioning them. What I mean by that is that the race relations and conflicts in the West have been very diverse. They stem out of the conquest of northern Mexico and the historic Mexican-American population in the Southwest and California. They involve Native Americans, the Indian Wars, the pacification and segregation of Native peoples onto reservations, and so on. And again, in all of those cases, whether it's Native Americans, Mexican Americans, or Asians, and then later in the 20th century, a growing African American population in the West, a mix of legal, political, and vigilante violence was used to impose order on that region. So I think I'll stop there because I'm at 15 minutes, and I can pick up some other themes later in my talk, but for now, I'll turn things over to Jamie.
All right, thanks so much, Will, and thank you, Kevin. I should add, Will was generous not to say this, the Water in the West course that Kevin and I put together, the funding to put that course together came from the Mellima Fund, or Mellima program. So we actually will owe you a course.
That's true.
And someday we'll get to that. All right, well, thanks for that deeper history. And I'm really going to pick it up in the 1970s. And there are a few things I want to do. One, I want to step back and say something about vigilantism, followed by, I want to reflect further on the mythology in the American West, which I think is part of the national conservative mythology today. And then I'll give you a couple of threads of where I see this having happened over the last 30 years. One of the key things when we think about vigilante action, at least in my mind, it conjures up the notion of someone who isn't just a criminal. In other words, they're not just out to for some personal gain or benefit. The vigilante is going outside the law or becoming a law to herself in order to serve a higher law or principle, or for the sake of a larger community. It's part of what gives that vigilante this sense of justice, even as they're breaking the law. So here in Michigan, if you remember, the Wolverine Watchmen plotted to kidnap our governor over the summer. And this was not about ransom. This was not just a kind of crime of malice, at least in their rhetoric. Governor Whitmer had trampled the Constitution. The legal systems had failed to hold her accountable. So they were forced, they were obligated as patriots to make a citizen's arrest and try her in a court of their own making. And I think it's that appeal to some higher authority to justify what is otherwise unchecked violence is a really key piece of this. So let me pick up, say a few more things then about mythology, because it really is, we're talking here about stories that define who we are, give us a sense of place and a sense of purpose. And I think there are some common narratives that have driven driven things all the way to the Capitol riot on January 6th. One of my favorite Western writers is William Kittredge, and he grew up in a small ranching community in Eastern Oregon, later leaving to teach creative writing at the University of Montana. And he writes about his upbringing and his experience with this both distance and criticism, and yet with a deep empathy. Let me quote him at length. He says, "A mythology can be understood as a story that contains a set of implicit instructions from a society to its members, telling them what is valuable and how to conduct themselves if they are to preserve the things they value." The teaching mythology we grew up with in the American West, he writes, is a pastoral story of agricultural ownership. At the same time, that mythology is a lens through which we continue to see ourselves. Many of us like to imagine ourselves as honest yeomen who sweat and work in the woods or mines or the fields for a living. And many of us are. Lately, More and more of us are coming to understand our society in the American West as an exploited colony, threatened by greedy outsiders who want to take our sacred place away from us, or at least strip and degrade it. In short, we see ourselves as a society of mostly decent people who live in some connection with a holy wilderness, threatened by those who lust for power and property. We look for Shane to come riding out of the Tetons. And our mythology tells us we own the West, absolutely and morally. We own it because of our history. Our people brought law to this difficult place. They suffered and they shed blood and they survived. And they earned this land for us. Our efforts have surely earned us the right to absolute control over the thing we created. The myth tells us this place is ours and will always be ours to do with as we see fit. Notice two key things in this quote. First, that ownership, the sense of entitlement, is first and foremost a moral claim. This is not about land title. It is about a kind of Lockean sense of ancestors mixing their labor with the land and gaining ownership over it, conveniently overlooking the violence that even made that possible. As one vigilante leader, Ammon Bundy, will tell anyone who listens, he would say, those living off the land in the American West have established God-given rights by claiming, using, and defending their lands and resources. So that's first, this kind of powerful moral claim. And second, hear the foreboding and the sense of threat, that what was given to us by God is under threat, in this case, from environmentalists, urbanites, Easterners, and perhaps corporations. I mean, that is a Western mythology. And this is not, he's not simply describing his childhood upbringing. Listen to this resolution that was introduced in the House of Representatives in 2006, a resolution supporting observance of a National Day of the American Cowboy. Quote, whereas pioneering men and women recognized as cowboys helped establish the American West. Whereas the cowboy spirit continues to infuse this country with its solid character, sound family values, and good common sense. Whereas the cowboy embodies honesty, integrity, courage, compassion, respect, and a strong work ethic and patriotism. Whereas the cowboy loves, lives off of, and depends on the land and its creatures, and is an excellent steward, protecting and enhancing the environment. I mean, this is a sort of, mythical celebration of the cowboy as the archetypal American, as the embodiment of patriotic virtue. Now, in the American West, this mythology, particularly in the 1970s, is mobilized against the federal government. Will mentioned Richard White, the historian. He once described the federal government as something like a scratchy wool sweater. It's fine if it's the only thing to keep you warm, but it's really uncomfortable. And beginning in the 1970s, the federal government basically rewrote environmental and land law and imposed a whole new way of managing federal lands in the West. And if you don't know those lands, they comprise essentially 50% of all land in the 11 Western states and Alaska. So the federal government was sort of putting new pressure on people like William Kittredge's family. And at the same time, the West economically was shifting away from natural resources and didn't depend quite as much on the federal subsidy. So these were mobilized as a way of protesting the kind of federal tyranny. The federal government was often likened to, King George and the British. References to the American Revolution were almost constant. And what I think is significant here is when you hear that story, the story where one group of people is identified as the true Americans, the true patriots, and the threat that they're up against, is a matter of real existential threat. That narrative, I argue in the book Kevin mentioned, This Land is My Land, is part of what built a powerful political coalition between Westerners, beginning in the 1980s, between Westerners, Southerners, Midwesterners, who for different reasons were angry with the federal government and trying to claw back what they thought was their rightful place. And if we follow from the 1980s through today, what we're really hearing is a kind of mythology of white Protestant conservative America. So, what you hear pretty regularly on Fox News is that they're taking our country away from us. What you hear from the protesters that went to the Capitol, they're taking our country away from us. And so, but I think to understand the sort of use and threat of violence, we have to appreciate the depth to which, a particular group sees itself not only as those who are ordained or the kind of holder of value and virtue, but also the degree to which they see themselves as victims, and the degree to which they see that life as they know it is under threat, pushing them to real extremes. And this certainly is, I think, part of what we've seen, and certainly what led up to January 6th. As a side, if I believed QAnon theories, right, I probably wouldn't be sitting talking about this. I would be taking some kind of action to protect my family. So keep that in the back of your mind, because I think what is fascinating is the way in which what maybe was more pronounced in the West, going back to an earlier period, is now national. And part of it is that shared mythology. It is at root a kind of civil religious mythology about what it means to be a real American and what it's going to take in order to protect this country that's being taken away from us. In fact, perhaps some of you saw the recent survey done by the American Enterprise Institute that showed that 39% of Republicans agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is fading away or falling apart so quickly that violent force might be necessary to sustain it. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about specifically the West and the issue of land. But what I want to do now is shift to the sort of 1970 through the present, and certainly not give a history, but just identify two threads, two of what I see as kind of the most interesting developments that take us from vigilante opposition to the federal government in the 1970s to the Capitol building. The first strand is the armed patriot movement, or the militia movement. In the 1960s and 70s, the militia movement was truly on the fringes of American society. The militias included groups like the Christian Identity Movement, a group of Christian racists who were preparing for a final race war. It included the Posse Comitatus movement, which was also explicitly racist and anti-governmental. They argued that the highest legal authority lay in the county level and that the federal government had no legitimate claim over them. If some of you have heard of the sovereign citizens, right, this is a similar rejection of the legitimacy of the federal government. These groups flourished in the 60s and 70s in the American West, both because there was space, but also because of the demographics, that many of them were going to places like Idaho and Montana that were still predominantly white in hopes of building a kind of Aryan utopia. And these groups were appropriately treated as extremists by government officials. For their part, they murdered police officers and FBI agents. But if we look at the militia movement, something important happens in the 1990s through the present. And that is that the militia movement rebrands itself, not explicitly about race, but now rebrands itself as defenders of the US Constitution. So no longer do you hear the explicit rhetoric that the Aryan nations used to have, Now what you hear is the argument that the federal government is illegitimate because it's trampling gun rights, property rights, or something else, and inhabited by these dark conspiracy theories that the government is going to disarm American citizens, kill them, turn the country over to communists or the UN. And so these militias were now positioning themselves as the simple defenders of American freedom and American character. And since then, I mean, if we look in the last 10 years, groups like Oath Keepers, 3% Patriots, I mean, these have featured prominently in Tea Party rallies, in Trump rallies. So it's basically the militia movement going mainstream. And so now we have groups that will mobilize, will deploy to any conflict around the country, heavily armed, ostensibly to protect constitutional freedoms. And in our discussion, we could maybe think about what they're really protecting. So that's one. And I think the militia movement's interesting because it's truly outside of the established system of law. I mean, maybe in their day jobs, some of these people are police officers or military, but in their militia activities, they are simply private citizens. And I would say that the threat of violence is itself part of what gives the militias their appeal and gives a militia member a sense of purpose, right? The cause must be righteous because I'm prepared to kill and die for the Constitution. But the second thread in this kind of vigilante justice, well, sorry, I should say that, there has been a fair amount of violence on the part of the militias and a certain number of fatalities. And we could talk about that. But the second thread to this vigilante justice, I find even more troubling because it's vigilantism by those with a badge or those who hold government office. These are people who simply decide that some laws are legitimate and some laws aren't, that they are in a position to decide what is and isn't lawful and authoritative, and they're willing to use the coercive force provided by their office in order to enforce their interpretations of the law. Now, I could give you a number of examples of this in the West with county governments and to a lesser extent, the state governments, but I'll leave you with just one example, which is, to me, the most curious. It's the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, founded about a decade ago and claiming a membership of hundreds of county sheriffs around the country. The sheriffs who identify with this movement say that because they're the highest elected law enforcement officers in the country, they can nullify state and federal laws that are illegitimate. And how do they know a law is illegitimate? Well, I'm being perhaps unfair, but it's when they disagree with it. And these sheriffs have gotten attention for refusing to enforce gun laws, for refusing to protect, particularly federal employees who are threatened and assaulted, for refusing to cooperate with state and federal law enforcement. And even here in Michigan, when the Wolverine Watchmen were arrested, Dar Leaf, the sheriff of Berry County just south of us, mused that it actually might have been a legitimate citizen's arrest because in his reading of the Constitution, this was permitted. So the fealty of their personal interpretations of the Constitution, their willingness to accept violence and threats of violence. In fact, many of them talk about gathering posses to enforce their views. I mean, this is the more, I think, terrifying to me because this is the vigilante movement within government. And this, I think, does lead to a failed state. So perhaps you've read some about who was involved in the Capitol insurrection. And certainly some members were Oath Keepers or from other militias. There were also sheriffs, police officers, military personnel, all people professing a deep commitment to the rule of law and to the Constitution. And so, but here they were, having declared Biden an illegitimate president and Congress corrupt. They interrupted a basic democratic process and were seeking to overthrow government in the name of their interpretation of the Constitution. And more than anything else, to me, what January 6th shows or showed is that vigilante justice is mainstream. It's not fringe. And that's part of what I think is most disturbing. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Will and Jamie. There is 1,000 directions to go in here. I'll just invite everybody to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand too. I think I'll be able to see that. But maybe I could just kick it off, and this is going to sound a little bit off your topics, but I wanted to raise it because I think it does kind of come back after a time. And that's really a concept that I've been reading about lately because I'm revisiting Brinkley's book on Roosevelt, which is titled The Wilderness Warrior. And it as you've been talking about the role of violence in the West, or sort of a martial metaphor for how the West is won, that's another narrative. It's a narrative around wilderness or wildness that you could say is in some ways connected to conservationist or even preservationist ideology, a kind of conservative way of looking at the world. You know, Roosevelt comes in as a kind of aristocratic hunter who also likes songbirds, and is going to save parts of the West. So, you know, I guess the question I have for you is, how has just the concept of the freedom that one has in wilderness shaped some of the kind of some of the movements and themes that both of you are working with?
I'll start. Just a couple of thoughts. One is a phrase that, again, Richard White, he's prominent for a reason because he's really good. He titled his History of the American West, his textbook history, "It's all of your problem and none of my own." And I think there's a connection there to the wilderness theme, that in the American West, you have that kind of American theme, individualism, but amped up. And it's the idea that the wilderness provides the place for you to be a truly free individual and on your own, taking care of yourself, not asking others to take care of you, and not having obligations to take care of others. It's not just that the wilderness gives you the space to do that, though. It's the wilderness that makes a man, and for Teddy Roosevelt, who you mentioned, this was part of the appeal for him. It's the challenges that the wilderness can kill you. The wilderness forces you to struggle against threats, not just that of the land or of wild animals like bears, but also the Native American. For someone like Roosevelt, Native Americans were almost part of the landscape. But the West was a place, the wilderness was a place to test yourself, and it's what made men into the right kind of men. And for Roosevelt, this is also where him as a law and order person, he was the chief of police in New York. He was a governor, he was president. I think he was governor, he was undersecretary of the Navy, but he was also fascinated by vigilantes. And so he loved telling stories about how when he was on his Dakota ranch, he'd meet these cowboys who'd broken the law, he'd meet outlaws who were basically good men, he'd help arrest outlaws. And then during the Spanish-American War, he recruited people from these experiences, sheriffs, cowboys, including people who'd sometimes been on the wrong side of the law. And he said, these are the right kind of people that we need to produce as a nation. And these are the kind of people that will win us this war against Spain, 1898, 1899. And so it's another good example of what I was alluding to and what Jamie mentioned. The line between vigilante and law and order is not a clean, bright line. The two are intermixed. Vigilantism, even subtly expressed in someone like Roosevelt and who he values and admires, has long been near or part of the mainstream in American policing and politics. Right, Jamie.
Now, I'll add, before the wilderness movement became, was sort of the environmental movement. Maybe we associate it with hippies and, deep ecologists, but the person who first suggested and achieved federal wilderness designation was Aldo Leopold. And he got the Forest Service to designate wilderness areas administratively in the 1920s. And Leopold, when he wrote about wilderness, there were a number of reasons for it. He said, but the important thing about wilderness is it needed to be a place that could absorb a 2-week pack trip. So however long you can ride in 2 weeks on a horse. And he said, one of the reasons we need that is so that we can go into the wilderness and reenact the stories of David Crockett, Daniel Boone, the stories of Western conquest. And so what's really interesting to me is, that's looking at it through this, a normed view of the landscape that is sort of morally black and white. There are the good people, probably white or definitely white and probably men. And then there's the land itself, the wild nature that has to be tamed, and for many, and included Native Americans. And that what happens, I think, since then is, even Richard White's book, it's Your Misfortune, what is it? And None of My Own.
It's all of your misfortune and none of my own, something like that.
Part of the problem has been that we have developed new moral lenses through which to see this. So even now, our preservation of wilderness, even now, the reclaiming of female voices and Native American voices from that landscape is threatening that very idea of the purpose of wilderness is to go out and reenact Western conquest. And I think that for, if you think about all the complaints about, being politically correct or cancel culture, or, a lot of these are to say, listen, there are now people questioning whether or not we, the true Americans, are morally good or not. There are people questioning whether this interpretation of the landscape is right, and that's deeply threatening.
There's an interesting irony in the fact that in order for that enactment to take place, the federal government would have to come in and take land to provide a context within which you could then enact that conquest, right? I mean, that's part of the irony here is that some of those early movements led to national parks, other forms of land where people could do those enactments that does mean the federal government coming in and violating what would otherwise be perceived as individual property rights.
Yeah. There's another interesting connection that, again, you were just alluding to, Kevin, and Jamie was alluding to. The wilderness is a place that brings regeneration. And at the turn of the century, so late 1800s, early 1900s, there was this fear that urban and suburban men, women, children would become morally and physically degenerate because they were either living in comfort, if they were middle class or upper class, or if they were working poor and they were living in dirty cities, dirty conditions. They wouldn't have the experience that farm kids, that Native Americans for that matter, or kids on ranches would have once had, that would have given them the clean air, the open space, and the manly tests that would make a man, the physical dangers associated with farming, ranching, or with conquest, or the same kind of physical challenges that a woman would have faced and made her a real woman, able and willing and eager to have lots of children. There's this fear that the American nation would become degenerate. The solution was, among other things, to create national parks, and that was part of the appeal in the early 20th century, but also creating faux experiences for children like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. One of the early movements that kind of disappeared and got folded into the Boy Scouts was the Woodcraft Indians. The idea was to try and give boys and girls in appropriate ways something like the experience and test of the wilderness. Well, that's also the appeal of this kind of regenerate violence that I was talking about, how violence can be redemptive and regenerating. Teddy Roosevelt, again, talked about this, how the challenge of war, testing of one's moral and spiritual and mental courage is what made you a real, full human being. And I couldn't help but think of that when I looked at some of the rioters storming the Capitol, maybe in particular the guy with the horns and the fur vest and all of that. But these are ordinary people who probably have jobs where many of them don't have much power. They do what their boss tells them. They live in a society where there's all sorts of big institutions, business, healthcare, government, and so on, that shape their lives. And this was a way to redeem something more powerful, more individualistic, with a moral and spiritual courage, and even perhaps a physical courage, facing down police and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, you can go do a lot of cultural and psychological analysis of what's behind that, but it's a reenacting of a mythology in a way that also, as you said, replays this conquest by white men of the original Old West.
Thanks. If I can add one thing about the land itself, because you make an interesting point, Kevin, about, well, there are a lot of ironies involved. And I don't want to suggest that federal lands provide, a metaphor for all things in America, but they might. That if we look back at the early 20th century, much of what the land the federal government owned was considered the public domain. It was slated legally for disposal, for sale, and to give away. And there was no functional regulation of it. And under those conditions, the court said that people had the common law right to use the public domain lands until such point as the federal government decided to manage it. So what you had was this interesting practice where you had people who benefited from federal violence in removing Native Americans, had created an empty space, a wilderness, actually paid a lot of bills for kind of land improvement. And yet the people who got to use it free and in an unrestricted sense. And the more that the federal law changed and those users were regulated, were told what to do, had to share that land now with, hikers from Boston, the more what had been, well, that's an okay use of federal power, suddenly became an infringement on their freedom. And I think that is in some ways a metaphor for the kind of what happens when a cultural hegemony, a certain white patriarchal society enjoys a kind of unquestioned privilege. And now under increasing challenge, now suddenly there's a chafing against that and this sense of loss that, as you point out, was never really theirs, but it was functionally theirs. And that does create a pretty powerful sense of, kind of proprietary sense about it, whether it's land or about culture.
Let's go to the questions. And as you may have heard at the top of the hour, I have to leave, I'm afraid, at 4:30. So Kate, you can take over, I hope. But I'll at least get one question in, and this is from David Malone. I'll sum up, is Dar Leaf a look into the future? So, the question about if vigilante justice has become mainstream and widespread, does that mean that policing isn't this sort of professionalized and separate kind of exercise, but has it become democratized, and how can it be constrained if we think about it in those terms? So that's a big question. Wants to take off with it?
Well, I'll start since I brought up Dar Leaf. I do think this is I was going to use the word crisis, but that seems too focused. I mean, this is a profound challenge. One of the things I think is interesting is since the Capitol riot on January 6th, the Pentagon and officers are sort of doubling down, trying to tell their troops, we serve one constitution, we're all part of the same mission, really working to emphasize a kind of unity of purpose and a unity of practice. And I think that is in response to the real fear that when the coercive power of government is no longer accountable to a kind of common set of strictures and a common oversight, but really maybe becomes, well, when Republicans hold office, law enforcement will look Republican, and when Democrats hold office, it'll look Democratic. I think that is a genuine fear, and I don't make any predictions, but I think certainly you're seeing that concern in what the way the Pentagon addressed that, and you see that in some law enforcement communities.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts there. Part of the reason why I went all the way back to the American Revolution and laid out some of that 19th and early 20th century history is to say there is nothing new about this blurring of the lines between official policing and unofficial policing. These go by various names all the way back to the colonial era, regulators. There were a variety of these kinds of groups during the Revolutionary era and in the 19th century. They were very common in the American West, and vigilantes sometimes worked with the locally appointed sheriff. The vigilantes were seen as supporting the official law and order, and when the official law and order wasn't doing it for itself, they would step into the breach. This is not new in American history, and there's a deep stream of political thinking that goes back to the Revolution that supports this. And it's not just on the right. I think Jamie is correct that it's more on the right than the left. And you could point to all sorts of examples, and Jamie gave some, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, who sometimes, there were several cases that I saw in the news the other day. Somebody in the Proud Boys beats up a left-wing protester, and the police arrest the left-wing protester. So there's a long history of this kind of cooperation between vigilantes and official policing that support one view of what law and order should look like. There are elements on the left. Probably the most famous is the Black Panthers, who in the 1960s pointed out that the police were not there to protect the freedom and rights and safety of African Americans, in California cities like Oakland, but rather were there to suppress them. And so they decided in good old-fashioned American vigilante fashion to become their own unofficial police and assert a kind of protective order in their neighborhoods, including against police. They also did soup kitchens and education programs. And so very much in that tradition of doing something American. When law and order fails, you do it for yourself. In this case, doing it in the context of them seeing police as not a failing ally, but police as the threat. When they went to the state capitol in Sacramento, famously with guns, they were doing something that was very American, except they were doing it from a from a civil rights and a Black power point of view, rather than a pro-segregation or a white power point of view. And they were quite self-conscious about that. Interestingly, it inspired among whites, including Ronald Reagan, an emphasis on gun control. When Black people did the same thing, this was considered a danger to the nation. And that was echoed actually quite recently by Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. He famously said, I think earlier this week, that he wasn't worried when rioters stormed the Capitol because he knew, kind of as Jamie was saying, that they had good intentions. These were people who support law and order, and they were doing what they saw fit. He said, now, if it had been a Black Lives Matter demonstration, then he wouldn't have been worried. It was his implicit way of saying, these are my people. I wasn't worried and I didn't fear them. Those are not my people. If they were doing something that looks similar, I would be worried.
Yeah. So I think I'm moderating now. And Kevin, I think read a question from David Malone that I don't see, which I guess means he sent it to Kevin. So I'm seeing questions in the chat, and there are 3, and I'll read those out. But if you want to ask another question, make sure you send it to everyone in the chat. So the first one that I see is from Virginia Van Andel, who says, to what degree do these views and beliefs fall apart with population crowding? It sounds as if the things that people fight for, they would no longer want when their own neighbor is doing it, and it impacts them adversely. Who wants to tackle that one? Do these things happen in the West more because there's so many more open spaces and people have more of a sense of entitlement, I guess, to act as if?
The short answer is no. We've mostly been talking about vigilantism and the American West in terms of rural areas and, say, small towns. But if you look to urban and suburban areas like Los Angeles, you find something similar. Jamie mentioned the militia in Michigan. Well, we can also find examples in Detroit. So you have legal means and police helping enforce them to promote housing segregation in cities like Los Angeles and Detroit, from the late 19th century all the way into the 1960s and 70s. And then when those legal or quasi-legal means failed, you would then have vigilante action, burning a house down if an African-American family, bought it in a neighborhood, beating people up, killing people. The Ku Klux Klan was live and active in Western American cities like Los Angeles and Portland. So it was also very much an urban phenomena about using this mix of vigilante, extra legal and legal ways of enforcing a certain kind of order. You found that in urban areas and suburban ones as well. I don't think it's about space. More space means more of that vigilantism. Crowded space means less of it. It just looks different, it seems to me.
Thanks. Jamie, do you want to?
Well, I would only add that, and I can't tell you exactly how, but I do think that population density does change the nature or the character of some of the myths that we're talking about. I mean, what is particularly Midwestern and Western? I mean, what's true of those Western communities, particularly ranching communities, is it is a lot easier to sort of present yourself as a self-made person, dependent on no one, when your nearest neighbor is 4 miles away. So I think some of the mythic understanding, but that just means it sort of it modulates a bit as opposed to goes away. Yeah. Again, to give some other examples that are less beautiful than ranches and little houses on the prairie, it would be oil, whether it's in Texas or California. And you'd find similar kinds of rhetoric about self-made men in the oil patches, or for that matter, in mining in the American West, and a similar kind of use of this mythology, either to defend vigilante action to keep out competitors, in the gold fields, for example, to keep out non-white competitors, so vigilantism against Chinese immigrants or Mexican Americans, and in the oil patch to assert control over labor and things like that, and similarly to justify government staying away and not regulating either labor or regulating land use and environmental degradation. The other urban examples I can think of are labor unions and a use of state National Guards, local police, and vigilante action to prevent labor unions from doing their work, from organizing or from holding strikes. There's a famous one in got in my notes here somewhere, 1917 in Bisbee, Arizona. So I think just before the United States, or maybe just after the United States entered World War I, and there was a threat of a strike in the mines in Bisbee, Arizona, and local vigilantes and police rounded up several hundred strikers, put them on a train, drove them out into the desert, and left them there without food and water. They only survived because they happened to cross an isolated small town and got water there. But that would be a good example of where vigilantism is in an urban setting, mining, and it's this mix of official law and order, local police and politicians with vigilantes, with business and personal connections to them.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the clock, and I think we should try to wrap up by 4:45. And since you had so much to say about that one, I think I'm going to be harsh and select one of the last two questions, because Cheryl's question is a good one, but it's a little bit similar about why this might be happening in certain places and at certain times. The last question by Randy Blacketer is a bit different, and I'd like to hear what you both have to say about that. The federal government hires mercenaries, private security firms, to help fight its wars with frightening connections to Calvin. We probably all know what that reference is about. Is this also connected with a vigilante tradition, or is it a different issue?
Ooh. Actually, now that I think of it, I do have a good answer to that. So some of the very first detective agencies, it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't think of the one from Chicago. If somebody thinks of it, maybe type it in.
Pinkerton?
The Pinkertons, thank you.
Yeah.
Private detective agencies like that, and detective is a nice term that puts a shine on it. They didn't indeed involve detectives who investigated and went undercover in labor unions and so on. But they also just include muscle thugs, whether armed with clubs or fists or guns. And those were used widely, not just in the eastern part of the United States, but to break up labor unions in the American West. So one of the more famous examples is in Ludlow, Colorado in 1913, where the governor eventually brought in the National Guard, but the local company, which was Rockefeller owned, also brought in, I don't know if it was the Pinkertons specifically, but one of those kinds of detective agencies. So that would be examples sort of at home rather than abroad, where owners of large businesses, facing strikes, would bring in hired muscle, so sort of a mercenary policing units, which again, often cooperated with local state police or National Guards. So
yeah,
again,
and I think
a long history of this.
I'm going to say yes and no as the answer. With Will, I think that what makes it really interesting is that on the one hand, it's different on the surface because the federal government is hiring private security contractors, stipulating exactly how they're to act, right? So that they're not being hired as vigilantes. They're basically being hired as, and not even as muscle in the sense of they're not hired to do things that the military wouldn't do. They're just, I don't know, a cheaper, more convenient way, basically to provide legally sanctioned services. The problem that we've seen is that, these organizations, Blackwater has gotten the most press, but they're not actually held accountable the way that the military is. So you're almost guaranteeing the circumstances where it will take on a kind of vigilante character precisely because, there's a reason why, whether or not we hold them to it, why there is a chain of command in the military, a review of actions, why when someone is breaking the rules of engagement, in theory, there's punishment. When you hire private security contractors, and when you shield them from prosecution in the local country, but you don't hold them accountable by military standards, I think that vigilante violence is, all but guaranteed. Because again, it's not as though they're, doing some food delivery. I mean, they're working in the midst of violence. And so, I think it's inevitable.
So in other words, the mechanism ostensibly is just the opposite of vigilante violence. It's the government hiring people, and the people are doing the government's bidding and not acting out some ideology of their own. But the kind of people who tend to be attracted to that come with a kind of ideology that sort of says, well, we're fighting bad guys, and so we should be able to do whatever it takes to kill the bad guys. And they feel a sense of almost moral entitlement to sort of flout the rules that would hold other people accountable. That's what I hear you saying.
And I just wouldn't go as far as to say trying to figure out who goes and works for Blackwater or joins these firms. That I don't know. That would be a really interesting story. But regardless of their intentions going in, I think structurally you're setting up an environment where that kind of vigilante violence will happen. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you all for coming. And I think if anybody came hoping that you'd both offer us optimistic advice on how the problem of vigilantism could be combated at the present moment, those people might be disappointed. But everybody who wanted to appreciate that this has a deep history and is complex and is going to be with us for a long time, really
sounds like we need a sequel.
Absolutely. All right.
hopeful
Thank you all
version.
very much. And I
Thanks
hope
so
to
much.
see a lot of you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.